Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to IDG Live. This is a pre-recorded live stream. So if you are there in the chat watching this as live, hi, great to see you. I might even be there in the chat, who knows, answering questions as we go along. But I obviously can't answer questions, super chats, whatever, live, as I'm just doing this pre-recorded. So thought I'd get that one out of the way to start with. But today, and also while I'm doing things to start with, um, I'll do my thanks. Patrons, thank you. I hugely appreciate you. You know how much I appreciate your ongoing support. It allows me to do this, which is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much. And secondly, moderators, I know that you'll probably be there. Keeping an eye on the chat even if I'm not doing this live. So thank you hugely. If you are there already nice and early, could you just show a little bit of love to the moderators in advance? All of that said, today we are looking at the Doom of Valyria. We said we would do a series looking at different mysteries in the world of ice and fire. And last time we looked at the Night of the Laughing Tree. This time, the Doom of Valyria. Now, we've all got a sort of a vague understanding of the Doom of Valyria, but what we're trying to do here is kind of pick through what it is. I've got an idea. I did a video on this. If you want the more detailed breakdown of what I think happened, but we've got another few ideas to work our way through. I will start by giving an overview of what it is, what we know. Then I'll set out my idea of what I think probably happened, trying to tie together all the different strands that we have. Then I've got some questions from my patrons, and I will work my way through them as well. So, the Doom of Valyria. This happened 400 years before the main story that we have 200 years before House of the Dragon. And this is 100 years, therefore, before Aegon the Conqueror conquered Westeros. So this is now significantly in the past. But this was perhaps the most significant event in the history, other than Long Night and things like that, in the history of certainly Essos. Perhaps Planetos even more broadly. The Valyrians had ruled their empire, they called it the Valyrian Freehold, that had existed for perhaps 5,000 years. And this was incredibly powerful. It was an incredibly strong empire, obviously, because of the dragons. The Valyrians were the only power in the world that had access to dragons, who, as we often, it's quite a sort of a lazy comparison, but I think it's a useful one. These are the nuclear weapons of that world. If you have dragons, suddenly that places you well above absolutely everybody else. It doesn't guarantee you winning in a war, but it's much stronger than anything anybody else can put up against you. So when I say doesn't guarantee you, we do get examples of wars, particularly against the Rhoynar, for example, where the Valyrians didn't always win. So that said, by the height of the Valyrian Freehold, they basically dominated Essos, which is massive, many times the size of Westeros. But what was interesting about this empire was that it was incredibly centralized. It was centralized around Valyria itself, the city and the areas around it. Now, this actually takes us to something George R. R. Martin has said in his Not a blog not too long ago, which is the fact that dragons do not range, they do not roam, they don't go anywhere. If they are settled somewhere, then unless they are actively ridden somewhere, then almost certainly they won't be going anywhere, which means that the the Valyrians stayed everything, the nexus of power was in that one place. It was this peninsula heading down into the sea, sort of halfway between Volantis and Slaver's Bay. And this was where the dragons were. This was where all of the magical, where the magical center of this freehold was, because they had the Valyrians as well as dragons. They had magic and they had technology, which were, although there were magics that perhaps could go toe-to-toe with the Valyrians, the magical technology was way beyond anything else that people could do. Just to pick out a few random examples, we know the Valyrian steel swords, the strongest, the longest lasting, the lightest, the sharpest metal imaginable. The Valyrian roads, these are long, straight, they did not degrade over time. By the time we get to the story, Tyrion stops and has a look. He's going along one of these roads. He has a look at it and he's amazed that this is at least 400 years old, probably much older. And there's no sign of wear and tear, not through the elements. It's been open to the elements, obviously, all this time. No sign of wear and tear all the way through, just people going on it, carts, horses, whatever, nothing. This is magnificent. And of course, they could sort of melt and mold their black stone. We see this most famously probably in Dragonstone, which is even more impressive in the books than it is in the show. There's the castle itself looks like dragons. You get arches, which is basically like a dragon's tail, like that. Dragon hands holding up sconces, basically, are holding up fire. So this is intricate, amazing stuff. Their technology levels were incredibly high. And they slowly were taking over, as I say, pretty much all of Westeros. The way this worked, because it was centralized, was that they had what later became known as the Free Cities. They were sort of run, the cities of Essos within the Freehold, they were sort of run at an arm's length from the Valyrian Freehold. Occasionally you might get one of the Valyrians heading out there on a dragon, but most of the time, no. So it happened on that day, 400 years ago, that 99% of the dragons, 99% of the Valyrians were there on the Valyrian Peninsula. The only ones that weren't, that we know of, are the Targaryen family, who, as we know, Daenerys the Dreamer had a vision of the doom and had managed to persuade her family to up sticks and to leave and to go and settle in Dragonstone. Now, everyone else we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, everyone else within the Valyrian world seemed to see this was a kind of like a surrender from the constant politics of their small world. But this was obviously foresight. They saw what was going on. So they were safe. They took 5 dragons with them. And there were a few dragons, we're not told how many, but some with their Valyrian riders on Lys. Now, Lys, we don't really get to see it all that much in the TV shows. Gets a few mentions in the books. Basically, this is a pleasure island. This was where the Valyrians went to have fun. And so there were a few there. And there's also one, we'll come back to him, who happened to be paying a visit to Cohor at the time. But all of the other dragons and the riders in Valyria. And then it exploded. Now, George R. R. Martin has talked about this a number of different times, and what he's just talked about is the inspirations as this kind of feeling of Krakatoa, this huge explosion that happens, or Vesuvius, or and this is something Tolkien talks about a huge amount, the great wave that just suddenly sort of washes over Atlantis or Numenor in Tolkien's world. This kind of idea of a great civilization suddenly ended just in one go, when something, nature itself, just like explodes and prevents or sort of destroys everything that's there. But he says this isn't just nature, there's a magical element too. And with everything, when you're talking fantasy, he says you just notch it up to 11, add in a magical element, and that's what we're talking about. And that applies not just to here, but also things like the Wall. The Wall, obviously inspired by Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall, if you've ever been there, it's ruined now, but it wasn't that high. It was a normal-sized wall. What George R. R. Martin did, took inspiration for it, cranked it up to 11, made it massively tall, added a magical element. It's also a magical barrier. That's the kind of idea that we're going with here. So I will read you what we have from the World of Ice and Fire as a description of what actually happened. It says, "It was a cataclysm such as the world had never seen. The ancient mighty freehold, home to dragons and to sorcerers of unrivaled skill, was shattered and destroyed within hours. It was written that every hill for 500 miles split asunder to fill the air with ash and smoke, and fire so hot and hungry that even the dragons in the sky were engulfed and consumed. Great rents opened in the earth, swallowing palaces, temples, and entire towns. Lakes boiled or turned to acid. Mountains burst. Fiery fountains spewed molten rock 1,000 feet into the air, and red clouds rained down dragon glass and the black blood of demons. To the north, the ground splintered and collapsed and fell in on itself, and an angry sea came boiling in. The proudest city in all the world was gone in an instant. The fabled empire vanished in a day. The lands of the long summer, once the most fertile of all the land, were scorched and drowned and blighted, and the toll in blood would not be fully realized for a century to come." So this, in and of itself, is an astonishing, cataclysmic event that killed untold numbers of people. All the dragons that were there, as we said, 99% of all dragons alive were there. The people, the land itself, mountains erupting. The whole thing is cataclysmic in the extreme. But then you get the knock-on effects of this, because the idea here, another bit of inspiration George R. Martin has talked about, is this is like the fall of Rome. This is the nation, the power that has been in charge of a continent for all this time goes, and what happens next? The technology lost, the knowledge lost, the power structures gone. There's a power vacuum. Who's going to fill that? All of this is kind of worked through in the history of what is known as the Century of Blood afterwards. First of all, we should just acknowledge the technology that's lost. Valyrian steel. We're not going to get any more of it. The knowledge of how to create Valyrian steel had gone. There were some Kahoric smiths who knew how to mold and shape existing Valyrian steel, but nobody knew how to create any new Valyrian steel. So suddenly it became huge, as well as it was already pretty expensive, but it became hugely rare, hugely scarce, and the ownership of those um, became incredibly coveted. So there was that. We also get the roads are still there, but all of the knowledge of history of dragon lore, for example, has gone. I talked about the power vacuum. The what we know as the free cities, all of them, bar Bravos, had been owned, run basically at arm's length by the Valyrian freehold. What was going to happen now? Well, Volantis made a bid to be seen as the new preeminent home of or successor state, really, to the Valyrian freehold. They went out trying to take lands in their own name, in the name of the Valyrian freehold that they claimed that they were heirs of. There were some, I've mentioned already, some dragons and their riders, which were still randomly dotted about. The ones in Lys, the people there just rebelled. And the feeling is, we don't get huge amounts of description here, but the feeling is very much like when you read about the storming of the Dragon Pit. Just thousands of people just rose up and took down those dragons and their riders. The guy, I think his name was Orion, up in Cohor, on that one dragon, he raised an army of 30,000 men. He flew his dragon and he headed off to Valyria, what was left of Valyria, and never came back. Nobody knows what happened. Because what we've got here is, I've got another quote, actually. It's probably the best way of saying it. Physically, what is left there is partly known because you can see it from the outside, but partly unknown because people do not return when they've been here. This is what we read. The shattered peninsula remains. Strange tales are told of it today, and of the demons that haunt the smoking sea where the 14 flames once stood. In fact, the road that joins Valantis to Slaver's Bay has become known as the Demon Road, and is best avoided by all sensible travellers. And men who have dared the smoking sea do not return, as Valantis learned during the Century of Blood when a fleet it sent to claim the peninsula vanished. There are queer rumours of men still living among the ruins of Valyria and its neighbouring cities of Oros and Tyria, yet others dispute this, saying that the doom still holds Valyria in its grip. A few of the cities, away from the heart of Valyria, remain inhabited, however, places founded by the freehold or subject to it. The most sinister of these is Mantaris, a place where the men are said to be born twisted and monstrous. Some attribute some attribute this to the city's presence on the Demon Road. So that's what we've got left. Not a place that people want to go to, not a place that is the heart of an empire anymore. And the century of blood that followed with this power vacuum, which is left there by people trying, they want to see whether they can take the Valyrian, whatever remains of the Valyrian Peninsula. That's not happening. So they say, okay, we're now the heirs of Valyria, and so they step up. But then wars break out between the free cities, and the shape of what we have today, the free cities are still free cities, but we get the disputed land down there in the southwest of Westeros, that area between Mir, Lys, and Tyrosh, that has remained disputed pretty much the entire time, aside from the short period of the Triarchy. That has remained a disputed land between them, because who owns which bits of land? It's just a matter of might, really. Then Pentos and Bravos fought each other many times. But the biggest shift was the Dothraki. The Dothraki had largely been kept in check by the Valyrians. But once the Valyrians had gone, then they multiplied and they expanded. And the Dothraki Sea started being created. It was always mostly grassland there, but there were empires there. There were cities there. And the Dothraki, one by one, Khalasar by Khalasar, took out all of these cities. We see the remains of these. Dany, when she's traveling with the Khalasar through the Dothraki Sea, every now and then they're passing through ruined cities. Those are cities in the Century of Blood and afterwards that the Dothraki have just wiped from the face of the earth. The cities that survived are the cities that either managed to somehow hold off the assault, or they pay tribute whenever the Dothraki arrives. And a classic example there is Pentos. The Dothraki, Khal Drogo made his way all the way to the west coast there. They were being basically paid off not to sack the city. So the Dothraki, having basically raised the entire center part of that continent, shifted the geography a huge amount, or the geopolitical ground of Essos a huge amount. What you have then is a situation where overland travel, you can travel through the Dothraki Sea just on a route straight into Vaestra Dothrak in the middle if you're there to trade, and you carry the right sort of symbols and things like that. But other than that, the sea routes are suddenly the more safe way to go. The free cities, there are a couple of exceptions, but broadly speaking, the free cities are along the coasts of Essos. And if you're wanting to get as far as Slaver's Bay, that is largely cut off. The main route from Slaver's Bay, we mentioned this a moment ago, across to the western part of Essos, that is the Demon Road, and nobody really wants to go there. So that's the sort of the background. What uh, what caused it? I mean, this is the $1 million question, isn't it? I have done, as I said, I've done a video on this. If you want to go and have a look at my more considered breaking down of the evidence, then I would recommend you go and check that out. Um, uh, the truth is, we don't have a clear attribution here. There's nobody stands up and sort of says this was me. There's no clear consensus about what this is. I've got a few coming up. I've got what the Maesters say about this, but it's fair to say that they don't have a clear understanding. It's very clear that the volcanoes blew up. That much uh, is pretty indisputable. It's very clear that this was a very magical place, and so the explosion was itself magical. And that has kind of lingered in a way. And the volcanoes were known as the 14 Flames, and it would appear this was Septon Barth says this. Septon Barth, as a rule of thumb, is usually right. He said he found in an ancient text somewhere that these 14 flames were held back, they were tamed, they were prevented from blowing up by fire mages. And all of this seems to kind of make sense. So the working assumption that I think 95% of people who've dug into this have got is that what happened was somebody messed with the fire mages. Too many fire mages were killed. Is this sort of short answer? How many do you need to kill in order to get all of them all to blow up? My guess is that if you get one volcano blowing up, then the rest of them are going to go. But perhaps this was, some people say, politicking. Just this isn't something we know the details of, because we don't know all the details of exactly how the Valyrian society worked. We do know that there were these 40 major families, and there was lots of politics going on between them. Fighting. Might one of them have just gone a bit too far and killed a few too many of these? It's possible. I mean, I think my take is that no one survived apart from the Targaryens. So if that did happen, this was an accident. This wasn't on purpose by someone who was trying to gain some advantage, because this is like, how do we gain an advantage? Well, let's just blow everybody up. That doesn't quite hang together for me. Some people have suggested the Targaryens, perhaps. Again, I see they didn't do anything for the next 100 years. Basically, they just, there was a few jaunts here and there, but they didn't look to extend their influence during the lifetime of the people who would have been around during the Doom, nor indeed in their children's lifetime or their children's lifetime. This does not come across as them destroying Valyria for some political bonus, something to help them out. They were, it's probably worth saying, we don't read about it huge amounts that 100 years, but they were indisputably the most powerful family with their dragons across all of Essos and Westeros. They could have carved out an empire for themselves, and they simply didn't. Not until, obviously, we get to Aegon the Conqueror himself. So it doesn't appear to be them. My working theory, and this is, I'd like to talk about working hypotheses, because I don't like putting this out as like, this is my theory because I think I'm going to live or die by whether this is right. I'm just trying to put together the evidence that we have, and on the basis of the evidence we have, the thing that I think most likely is what follows. If we get more evidence and that points in a different direction, I will very happily move over there and say that's my new working hypothesis. But what we have is the idea that well, a number of different strands, and I'll try and pull them together. First of all, let's start with the Faceless Men. Now, that's not a random place to start, because the Faceless Men themselves started in the mines of Old Valyria. They started underground. The kindly man tells Arya this story, and the starting point for the Faceless Men was that all of these slaves were there under Old Valyria, in the mines. It was incredibly hot. So hot that their feet would burn through the sandals they were wearing. And the first ever Faceless Man was a guy who, we're told, he heard all these slaves crying out to their own gods, crying out for death, just to end it. And he thought, they're just really just calling out to one god, the many-faced god. And he decided to give that gift that they were all crying out for on behalf of the many-faced god to one of the slaves, who was basically said, I want this to end. This is so horrible here. And we read this. You have to remember, Arya has an incredibly strong sense of right and wrong. And we read this. Arya drew back from him. He killed the slave? That did not sound right. He should have killed the masters. And then the kindly man replies, he would bring the gift, that's the gift of death. He would bring the gift to them as well, but that is a tale for another day, one best shared with no one. So this isn't an admission from the Faceless Men, but it sounds like, at the very least, they're saying they did kill some of the Valyrian masters. Now, if we take that as the starting point, the Faceless Men killed the Valyrians. It's as close as we've got from anyone to be claiming responsibility for the doom, and we have to understand that the basis of them doing that was not, as a lot of people assume, in order to kind of get revenge or out of some sense of justice. That's what Arya is saying. That guy should have killed the masters because that would be just. And the answer is no. Because, as the person repeatedly says, this is not a matter of who deserves to die. This is a matter of who has been called, who has called out, who has prayed the prayer for death, and ultimately, as it turns, as the Faceless Men cult, I think is probably the best way of saying it, develops, who pays for it. So this isn't a matter of them deserving it to. The implication has to be that they were hired to. So then we have to say, who hired them? Well, who would have the motive for it? Lots of people, I think, is the answer. So we could try and go down that route in lots of different ways. But I think the main point that I was made earlier, that nobody really took advantage politically. It seems like everybody was on the back foot. There's none of the other than the Targaryens, none of the other major families survived. None of the rivals to the Valyrian freehold seems to have been ready and to go and then immediately took over. Everybody seemed really shocked by what happened. And I don't personally think the Targaryens appear as if it was them. I won't rule them out. We will talk about that a bit more in a moment. But nobody there seems to kind of scream out that it was them. We do, however, have a throwaway line from Marwyn the Mage when he's talking to Sam, when he says, "Who do you think killed all the dragons the first time around?" And he means the Maesters. Now, we've often interpreted that as being, like after the Dance of the Dragons. But does he mean it at another level? The first time around, the last time, is like, what actually killed all the dragons was the Doom. So who is he implying that the Maesters caused the doom in some way? They would certainly have a kind of a motive. We know that they are anti-dragon. We know that they're anti-magic. And the Westerosi are anti-slavery. And although the Valyrian freehold was very centralized and it wasn't expanding westwards as fast as you might think, it was expanding westwards. One by one, it reached the far west coast of Essos, and one by one, the islands off the east coast of Westeros were starting to fill up with Valyrians, including ultimately the Targaryens. Dragons were seen flying over Westeros. This must have started to feel like a bit of a threat to the Westerosis. And added to which, this would leave them, and possibly Ashai, as the preeminent knowledge capitals of the world. So, is there a motive there? Yeah, potentially. So I think we hold on to that thought. As I said, there's lots of threads here, and then we try and draw them all together. The third thread is one that we read in the World of Ice and Fire. When we're reading about the Westlands, the Lannisters, and we read this: the wealth of the Westerlands was matched in ancient times with the hunger of the freehold of Valyria for precious metals. Yet there seems no evidence that the Dragon Lords ever made contact with the Lords of the Rock, Casterly or Lannister. So this is saying that the Valyrians, they loved gold, they loved precious gems. In the Westlands, the Lannisters, they had all that. This was the greatest source of all of this. And yet, mysteriously, although everybody knew about Lannister gold, the Valyrians didn't go there. They didn't make contact. So we read on. Septon Barth speculated on the matter, referring to a Valyrian text that has since been lost, suggesting that the freehold sorcerers foretold that the gold of Casterly Rock would destroy them. So now we have a little bit of prophecy, and we do have to take prophecy seriously in this world. So the prophecy here is that the gold of the Lannister gold would destroy them. Now, how do we think the Lannisters did it? No, there doesn't seem to be a particular reason why, because this would cost a huge amount of money. Let's not face it. There's no reason to think that they would have a motive for destroying all of Valyria. However, we do get a bit of information about the Lannisters and the Valyrians, which was that around that time, Valyrian steel swords were being made to order by the Valyrians for noble families in Westeros. But they refused to make one for the Lannisters. Why? Because Lannister gold would destroy them. So House Lannister desperately wanted this. What were they going to do? We know that they ended up with a sword called Brightraw. We know that they got this sword in the end. How did they get it? And we know that they paid enough, I can't remember the exact phrase, I think it was enough to raise a huge army, or something like that. They paid way over the odds, even for a Valyrian steel sword. They must have got it from somewhere. They must have paid someone to do it. So then that someone had the Lannister gold. Who else in the world might have known how to make, or at the very least reforge, Valyrian steel? Well, obviously within the freehold itself, they didn't want to do it. We know that in Qohor there are some smiths, but they were at the time in the freehold, and if they went against the Valyrians, then that was an incredibly dangerous business for them. What about the Maesters? The Maesters do know how to reforge, this is, not create from new, reforge Valyrian steel, and they do have a significant amount of it. How do we know this? Because the links in the chains that they give to the maesters, one of them for the higher mysteries is Valyrian steel, which mean, and they've been giving this out. Yes, only we're told 1 in 100 maesters ever learns that, but that's still a link every now and then for 400 years, it would appear, at least since the Doom, which means that they must have had a huge supply of it to start with to be making all of those links. Even if they're only giving out one a year, then that's 400 links. That's a reasonable amount of Valyrian steel, and they know how to forge it because they have to be able to make it into a link for a chain. Nobody else makes links into the chain out of Valyrian steel like that. Valyrian steel this is for weapons, this is for armor, this isn't just for common chains. So they know how to do this. They have a grudge against the Valyrian freehold. The Lannisters could pay for it, get the sword from them, and then what do the maesters do with this money? Hire the Valyrian freehold to hire the faceless men to eliminate the Valyrian freehold. It's my working hypothesis. It ties together the strands that we have, the Lannister gold strand that I think we need to face up to. It ties together the faceless men claiming that they were the people who brought death to the masters, and it ties in this idea with the maesters killing the dragons the first time around. So it's not watertight yet, but this is my working hypothesis on what's going on. So, all of that said, let's go to a few questions that we have from I asked over on Patreon what questions people might have here, and we had Jay saying, "Hi, Robert. I hope you're well. I am, thank you. What was the Westerosi interpretation of the Doom as it happened, and in the near-term aftermath? Thank you." So this is sort of building on what I've said already, and the answer, obviously, we have to cover it, is that we're not told exactly because we don't have any records matching that at that particular time. Added to which, it's probably fair to say that the vast majority of people in Westeros wouldn't really have known about Valyria, other than kind of like in legend, of like this far off, mysterious place. They'll probably have heard of dragons, but that's probably about it. And then what happened? It all got destroyed. Who would have actual thoughts about it? I suppose the noble families may well have had contacts, or will have had, many of them, contacts with Valyria, and the maesters definitely had contacts with Valyria. But on the build-up to the Doom of Valyria, didn't say this earlier, I don't think, the maesters sent many maesters over there to learn as much as they could and come back. So they gained as much knowledge as they could before the Doom. But what we do have is the World of Ice and Fire, which is an in-world history written by the Maesters, basically. And this is what they say, which I think probably captures the most likely things that people would have said. To this day, no one knows what caused the Doom. Most say that it was a natural cataclysm, a catastrophic explosion caused by the eruption of all 14 flames together. Some Septons, less wise, claim that the Valyrians brought the disaster on themselves for their promiscuous belief in 100 gods and more, and in their godlessness, they delved too deep and unleashed the fires of the seven hells on the freehold. A handful of maesters, influenced by fragments of the works of Septon Bath, hold that Valyria had used spells to tame the 14 flames for thousands of years, that their ceaseless hunger for slaves and wealth was as much to sustain these spells as to expand their power, and that when at last those spells faltered, the cataclysm became inevitable. So, 3 ideas here. This was just a natural disaster, which is probably what the majority of people thought. Or this was the answer of the Faith of the Seven. They were heretics. They were doing things that were wrong in the sight of the Seven, and therefore this was the doom was what they deserved. That's the kind of the faithful response. And then the third, which is slightly more informed, but wasn't contemporary. Septon Bath didn't happen for some 200 years, really, nearly after, certainly 150 years after the Doom. But this idea that we talked about before, that they kept the 14 flames in check through fire magic, and it's only when that faltered that they exploded. And as I said, that faltering, we do need to go to the next question, which is, well, why did it falter? Did they just take their eye off the ball? That seems quite unlikely. I mean, if I were living on 14 volcanoes, I would want to make sure that could happen. That wouldn't happen. But did somebody deliberately get rid of the people who are stopping it happen? That seems reasonably likely to me. Anyway, Dominic Vaughan. Hi, Robert. Hope you and the legendary Dan the dog are well. We are, thank you. Dan, I had a couple of people over on Patreon say, oh, if this is pre-recorded, could we get a Dan sort of cameo? And I tried to tempt him on, but I think he doesn't like it. When I put this green screen thing up behind me, he knows that I'm just going to be sitting here just talking for the next while, and he just like sighs and goes out of the room. So if he comes back, then yes, definitely. But I will probably not on this one. Next time I do one of these, I will tag a picture on the end just as a reward for getting all the way through, so you get to see a picture of Dan. Anyway. Do you think we will ever get to see, this is Dominic Ford, do you think we will ever get to see the Freehold in its heyday? I heard HBO had optioned a show, but mostly either in a Bran flashback or in another Westeros book. So yes, this was one of the ideas for a TV show. And to be clear, HBO have bought, we obviously don't know all of the lines of the contract, but they have bought the right to be making TV shows in George R. R. Martin's world. So they're not doing this on a case-by-case basis. They're not saying, okay, well, hey, George, do you want to, can we option this idea? And then George just signs it off and says, that's fine. They've bought outright upfront the chance to make stuff in his world. And they started out, I'll give a full update at some other point about where we all are. Obviously, we know we've got the one that's already up and running and the one that is going to happen, the Night of Seven Kingdoms, that will happen later this year. Nothing else has officially been greenlit, is the thing to say at the moment of me speaking. Nothing else has been officially greenlit. There are rumours of things that are potentially going ahead, but we haven't had the announcements. But in the early days, there were a lot of different ideas, some of which kind of fell to the wayside. One of which was a flea bottom one, the kind of a spear carrier's idea. George R. R. Martin quite liked it. I quite like the idea that most of what we see in A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, and House of the Dragon, it's all the 1%. It's the nobles of the land. And he thought, he loves the TV show Rome, if you ever saw that, where they tried to show it from the perspective of the spear carriers, of the guys who just, they're there, they see stuff, but they're not the people making the decisions. So that was an idea, but that idea went by the by. One of the ideas was this idea to have something set in old Valyria, and it was going to be a big political thing. Off the top of my head, I think that we heard potential showrunners sort of talked about they were going to have a couple of different sort of parties, always vying for power and leading up to the doom of Valyria, which sounded really good. But that idea has, as far as we're aware, that's sort of gone by the wayside. George R. R. Martin prefers the term shelved for ideas. I think is probably right, is that a lot of these ideas that aren't going to go ahead doesn't mean that they're not good ideas. It also doesn't mean that they're never going to go ahead, and probably just as importantly, it doesn't mean they're not going to go ahead in another format. So an example is the Sea Snake idea TV show, Corlys Velaryon, the 9 Voyages. It was being developed as a live action thing. Decision has been made, we're not doing that. However, they're now trying to develop it as something animated, which might work even better, in my view, for that particular thing. Because the whole point about it would be going to see fantastical places, a new place every season, possibly even every episode, a kind of a Sinbad feel, that if you were going to be building sets from scratch for every single place you go to, the cost would be astronomical. If you do it animated with some really good animators, then that would be a lot cheaper, and also you'd be able to do things on a much grander scale. But anyway, I'm digressing. Yes, there was an idea to do a Doom of Valyria or pre-Doom of Valyria show, but that did sort of go by the wayside. Is there a chance that we will get to see the Freehold in its heyday through a Bran flashback or another Westeros book? In terms of a Bran flashback, I mean, I'm not saying never. We've not yet seen the full extent of Bran's powers, but my instinct is no, for 2 reasons. First of all, we don't know whether. Yes, we've been told that he will be able to see beyond the weirwood trees, but there does seem to be a gap, a crossover to Essos. Can he see all the way over there with his green seer powers? It's not 100% clear. And then secondly, what kind of plot reason do we have here? I can certainly understand that you might have him learning about things that happened in the first long night, maybe even shy to finding out things which happened there. Things that happen in the Valyrian Freehold, that's would be really useful and interesting for people who wish to ride dragons, for example, but not necessarily in terms of people whose focus is on fighting against the others. So probably not that. Similarly, Dunk and Egg, I can't see how that would work. And Fire and Blood Part 2, Blood and Fire, will be focusing on Targaryen history after that. So, I mean, I don't want to say definitely no. And if you'll allow me to live in Dreamworld for a while, after George R. Martin has finished writing A Song of Ice and Fire and Dunk and Egg and Blood and Fire, then hey, maybe he wants to expand a world book into other parts of the world. But I think let's just focus on the books that he's already said that he's going to be writing before we get on to try and suggest books that he might write in the future. So Vance. With a similar question asking, do you think we'll ever get another glimpse of the current state of Valyria, like the Aeria Targaryen snippet from Fire and Blood? Well, sort of more recent, so post-Doom, I think is what you're trying to say. It's entirely possible in Blood and Fire. We do know during that time of Uncle Gerion, or Gerion, however you wish to pronounce it, that's Tyrion, Jaime and Cersei's uncle, who headed off there and didn't return. Now he's clearly a Lannister rather than a Targaryen, and Blood and Fire will be focused obviously on the Targaryens. But I'd be surprised if we don't get at least a throwaway line or two about that. Now, as for seeing it in the modern, the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, perhaps through Dany's eyes. So Dany, our working assumption, is going to, having spent her time in the Dothraki Sea, come back to Myrine, gather together her armies and a massive fleet, and head off westwards to go to Westeros. If they're going to do that, they're going to have to go past what was the Valyrian Peninsula, and perhaps she might get a little curious. Perhaps she could climb on Drogon. Perhaps she could do like a little swoop through, see what's going on. I would love that. I suspect George R. R. Martin would adore writing about that. But it strikes me as being one of those things that it would be not necessarily just sort of going into character. Dany, although she would be interested, she's not ever seen herself as a student of history. She doesn't come across as that. She seemed, I suspect when she comes back, she's going to be very focused on going forward, not looking back. That seems to very much what she's wanting to be doing. So it would also completely skew a chapter away to be looking at something which isn't central to the plot of her getting to Westeros, which I would file that under, and I mean that there are links across, but I would file that under when Tyrion was passing through the Sorrows. George R. R. Martin wrote a chapter in which Tyrion meets the Shrouded Lord. It's very magical. And George R. R. Martin wrote the chapter. He enjoyed it. He thought it was good. But then eventually he put it in a drawer in his desk because he decided it distracted away from the story. He didn't want Tyrion going down that magical route right then, maybe later, but then it just took things away in the wrong direction. And I suspect that would be his instinct as well with this. So I think we will see things from afar. It wouldn't surprise me if she does sort of like get on Drogon and fly over a little bit, but I don't think we're going to get an expedition in and her investigating things. Wrestler saying, "Hey Robert, I hope you and Dan are well. Thank you. What do you think has led to no one ever returning from Valyria, potentially? Is it simply that there are dangerous creatures there that kill anything that enters, or is it the environment itself, or a combination of both?" I think it's a combination of both. So, just to quickly list what we know. We've got Orion, who was that dragon rider who was in Qohor. He took himself on his dragon and 30,000 troops soon after the Doom, headed down there, and they were never seen from again. We have a fleet from Volantis, who, again, at some point in the Century of Blood, in the few years after the Doom, headed off to see what was going on there. They were never seen from again. Tommen II Lannister, again, this is in the Century of Blood. He was the Lannister King of the Rock. With Bright Roar, he headed over there to see what he could see. He never returned. Uncle Gerion Lannister headed off there not too long, actually, before the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire. He never returned. Arya Targaryen, who we read about in Fire and Blood, did return. We're pretty certain that she did go to Old Valyria. And we get Euron, who claims to have returned. I'll talk a bit more about Euron in answer to another question. But so that's what we have, is we basically have an area of those ones, if we're leaving Euron to one side for a moment, of those ones that we know about, she's the only one who returned, and she survived for literally a matter of minutes or hours on arriving back in King's Landing. So basically everybody died, and that is what is preventing people from going there. The sailors do not want to go there. You cannot get, it would appear from what we've heard, you cannot get sailors, free sailors, to agree to go. They just say no. So you have to get slaves if you're wanting to be going there. As for what is there and what remains, is it sort of like something in the atmosphere? Is it scary monsters? We have the smoking sea. Even hundreds of years later, the area there is still smoking and bubbling and potentially poisonous or magical or something. We have strong rumors of deformities among people in the lands close by, both of which imply to me something lingering. And this is sort of almost something in the air, something in the ground, something in the sea. The feeling that I think George R. R. Martin wants us to have is that this wasn't just like some volcanoes blowing up, and once everything's worked its way through the atmosphere, we're okay again now. This was a magical city which just exploded in one go, and the destruction has just kind of left this magical haze over the place. The ground is kind of a magical radiation, I think, is the way that he would imply this, which impacts across the piece. So there's that kind of underlying thing, and then there's also some kind of hint of monsters or something along that. We get when Aria comes back, obviously this is when George R. R. Martin heads most towards the horror genre. When she comes back, she's got these fireworms in her body, in her arms. There's something there that seems to have damaged Balerion, ripped a huge gash in his side. There's and everything that goes there is destroyed, which seems to imply not just like, oh, there's one monster you might come across, but lots of things. That there is definitely a suggestion that what is there is something living there, or some things living there that are horrific. We get repeated references when we're hearing about the Valyrians that deep underground they were basically doing genetic engineering, gene splicing animals, horrific animals together. Is this where they got dragons came from initially? It's possible, but the horrors we read about the Faceless Men, the horrors in beyond the walls, when the slaves were there in the mines, just living in the lava, suggests that whatever it was, these magical things that were going on there, they survived. If they live in lava, they could potentially survive a volcano eruption. And these half-formed creatures, have found a habitat that they can survive in now on the Earth. They can't go beyond it because they need to live in hot conditions. But anyone who goes in there gets destroyed in some way. Now, all of that said, it sounds quite vague, and I think George R. R. Martin has kept it vague. There's some kind of magical radiation or something affecting the area. There's some kind of big monsters there that could even attack Balerion and damage him. But George R. R. Martin, like with magic as a whole, he wants it to remain mysterious. He wants it to have this aura of you do not know what is there. And he does not want us to know exactly what's there. So I think this adds to my feeling we're not going to actually go in and see it. This is just a place you don't go, and your imagination is what is providing the dangers. UCLA Jedi Knight saying, this isn't Valyria specific, more a general question. One aspect of the history of this world that struck me as a bit disorienting is how different its focus is compared to the main story. When the series begins, the central conflict revolves around the Starks and the Lannisters, with other houses like the Baratheons, Greyjoys, etc. involved. Meanwhile, the Targaryens are pushed to the sidelines, with their two main survivors being the Beggar King and his younger sister. Even though Dany grows very powerful, she's still stuck in Essos, and likely will be even for much of the next book. Yet when you read their histories, it's almost all about the Targaryens, with the occasional Baratheon popping up. The Lannisters, who are portrayed as villains in the main story, barely even exist before Tywin's rise. The North feels distant from everything, is only brought into the fold to meet the Stark storyline. The shift in focus is clearly intentional, as we're told the Targaryens ruled for nearly 300 years with dragons, making their history naturally dominant in the narrative of Westeros. Even major wars often revolve around Targaryen factions. So, You read the main books, get drawn into the Starks, learn to know the Lannisters, and getting curious about the Targaryens. But when you dive into the history, it's overwhelmingly Targaryen-centered. So what's going on here? Well, I mean, I think, yes, this is a more sort of conceptual kind of question. I think there's a few things here, and I think we have to be honest that George R. R. Martin does seem to have become more interested in the Targaryens as his writing has developed. He could have chosen to do any kind of world book to start with, talking about the world of Ice and Fire. He could have chosen to do any kind of world book, but he decided to do this as an in-world maester writing about history as well as geography, but history about Targaryen rule. Large chunks of this are about Targaryen rule. He could have had a complete geography thing with telling us all about the lands. Yes, it says the lands about of Essos and further, but the amount of information we have there gets less and less the further away we have. So it was an active decision to do that. He's written 3 novellas, which have formed basically a part of Fire and Blood, which is a history of Targaryen rule, and that he's going to do a successor to that, Blood and Fire, which is more Targaryen rule. The short stories that or novellas that he's writing, Dunk and Egg, is about a Targaryen ruler in his younger days. So it is, for me, it is indisputable that yes, George R. R. Martin he's made active decisions that away from the main story, he seems more interested in and wishes to actively talk about the Targaryen side of things rather than other things. How has this shifted? Well, his initial idea, he said this many times, particularly with the direwolf news. If you've not heard this direwolf news, Google it. I'm sure if you're watching this live, then one of the moderators will provide a link. George R. R. Martin talked about it in his latest Not blog. Scientists have brought direwolves back to life. Real direwolves. I mean, this isn't an April the 1st thing. This seems to be real. But anyway, George R. R. Martin has said on many occasions that his original idea here was, for this whole story, started out with the image of the direwolf mother and the pups, and then the Bran comes next with the siblings. So that's where it comes from. So his initial idea is Starkish, and then it kind of expanded out from that. His original idea for the story was a story in 3 acts, really. Act 1 which was supposed to be book 1. Act 1 is the civil war raging in Westeros between the Starks and the Lannisters. Act 2 is the invasion of the others. Act 3 is the invasion of the dragons. And or vice versa, I should say. The dragons was Act 2 and the others was Act 3. So based on his original plan, we're actually still in Act 1, which doesn't give you a huge amount of hope for can he finish this whole story in 2 books, but let's leave that one to one side. So we're still in this bit of the story before we get the dragons and Targaryens coming in, but he's just had to tell us the story of Dany leading up to that point. So that is why we're at what we're at. And in the story, the Targaryens will come to the fore. We've already got Fagon, the Fagon storyline, and at some point, Jon's heritage is going to come out. So this idea of Targaryen rule will definitely become more important. But this Act 1, he has stretched it out not just in length but also in breadth, giving extra plot lines out into Dawn with the Ironborn, etc., etc. So that's what's happening, and that's why the Targaryens seem less important, whereas I think later on they will become more important. Rabbi Mitra saying, salutations, Robert and Dan the dog. Salutations to you too, sir. The House of the Dragon show created the show canon history involving Daenerys, the dreamer, her mother Eliana, and their financial situation prior to the doom. Basically, if you take their train of thought forward, they seem to be aligned with the fact that Aenar the Exile, with Eliana and Lady Macbeth-style role, potentially caused the doom. I know you prefer the idea that it's the Maesters, but Aenar is another candidate in the fandom. What do you think of all this? The show's choice and fandom's option for Aenar being the missing link between the Lannister Gold and the Faceless Men. Well, an explanation for those who missed this. In House of the Dragon, there we got a few times bits of history we get shown by pages of books and things like that. So one of them was we saw Rhaenyra looking at a book about Visenya, which is perhaps who she's considering emulating in some way. But we also get a page in a book. It's a double page, and both sides tell different versions of the same story. And the character that we knew before was Daenerys the Dreamer. She's the one who got the dream about the doom and persuaded her father, who is Aenar, to take the whole family off to Dragonstone. So that bit we knew, but more was added in here. Now, I will read what we've got, then I will sort of let you know what my thoughts. So I'll just read one of the two. The two they're very similar, but they give slightly different emphases. We read, the Targaryens were far from the most powerful of the Dragon Lords, and their rivals saw their flight to Dragonstone as an act of surrender, as cowardice. But Lord Aenar's maiden daughter Daenerys, known forever as Daenerys the Dreamer, had foreseen the destruction of Valyria by fire. What isn't widely known, however, is that Daenerys had claimed Balerion, at that time no bigger than a horse, the night before her faithful dream. And when the doom came, 12 years later, the Targaryens were the only Dragon Lords to survive. Let us go back and return to that fateful day when Daenerys awoke in her gilded bedchamber, shaking, running swiftly to her mother, Eliana. She spoke of what she had seen. Eliana Targaryen, it must be said, was a dour and gloomy woman. Her family's fall from dominance vexed and angered her, but instead, Eliana tossed gold coins to merchants and seamstresses as if they were plentiful. So the picture we get from this is that the Targaryens had been one of the more powerful families. There were only 40 dragon riding families in Valyria, we've been told. They had been one of the more powerful ones, and then they've kind of fallen in influence for some reason during relatively recent history. However, the mother, Eliana, or Elena, we don't know exactly how that's pronounced, she seemed to be angry about this, and also seemed to be not wishing publicly to be seen to have, or didn't want the family to be seen in public as being of lower standing. So she would still be throwing the gold coins around to various people, make it look like they're still rich. So that's what we're told. And Daenerys, however, then first of all, she went to her mother, which is a different twist to what we're told before. And then the other thing of interest is the fact that she had the night before claimed Balerion. Now, the Balerion link, therefore, is actually quite interesting because we kind of put this across to say, well, okay, we have several people now who have ridden Balerion who perhaps have had these kind of dragon dreams. We know that Aegon had a dragon dream, at least one, foretelling. We know that that Viserys had a foretelling of some kind, which does lead us to ask, what about the other people we know who rode Balerion? What about Maegor the Cruel? What about Princess Arya, who we were talking about a bit before? Might Balerion be some kind of magical conduit to seeing the future? We don't know all the details of that. But does this story in some way imply that this could be the Targaryens? For me, who caused the doom? For me, no. It perhaps adds in um, a hint more motive for them that they were down on their luck a bit, but would a family that's down on its luck a bit blow up absolutely everybody? That's not the impression we've got from any of these Targaryens. As I said, the notable thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that when they got to Dragonstone, and if we're saying this was their plot, it had worked, and all the Targaryens had died. They didn't try and do anything. They didn't try and claim any more power. They didn't invade anywhere else. They didn't start up a new Targaryen kingdom over any lands anywhere. They just stayed on their small rocky island. So none of that for 100 years, generations. So none of that to me screams that the Targaryens were behind this. What it does is it adds just a little bit of color. Firstly, to Balerion. Balerion might not just be a dragon. There might be some kind of thing going on there, prophetic thing going on there. And secondly, to the family itself. They had been more powerful, and then they lost some power in some way. We should also say, as we always do with House of the Dragon, that was not written by George R. R. Martin. Now, I've got no reason to think that that is against anything that George R. R. Martin would have said. It also doesn't change anything hugely, as far as I'm concerned. It adds flavour, as I say. There's a few extra things we can learn in there, but I don't think this tells us anything new, in particular, about the Doom or even Daenerys. So I like it, but it's semi-canon at best, and I don't think it changes dramatically anything. But I'm happy to put stuff down, and I won't be able to read the comments as this isn't live, but put things down in the comments below. Sorry, I won't be able to leave a live chat. Put things down in the comments below if there's something I've missed there, because it's entirely possible. But yeah, for me, that's not the smoking gun for the smoking scene. Stephen Mansfield. Hey, Robert, I was wondering if you see any similarities between the Maesters and the Faceless Men. They both seem to be anti-magic and anti-dragons. We know the Faceless Men are anti-slavery. The Maesters wear chains. I suspect some of the early Maesters were bought from Valyria as slaves, and the Maesters' skills accreditation system is a remnant of how Valyria marked their skilled slaves. Similar to the tattoos. I wonder if this lineage is why they are anti-magic and anti-dragon. Also, what is the history of slavery in Westeros? I wonder if they stamped it out the Citadel, through their manipulations. Are there any other possible connections between the two? Well, just to pick up on what's the history of slavery in Westeros, slavery has been abhorred in Westeros for millennia. It was hated by the old gods, the faith of the old gods, and by the faith of the Seven when they came across. So this seems to have been something which was in place already and stayed in place when the Andals arrived as well. And obviously when the Rhoynar arrived, they similarly were anti-slavery. The slight discordant note in all of this is the Ironborn. The Ironborn do practice having thralls and salt wives, both of which, although they're not called slaves, basically are a form of slavery. So that being off the coast of Westeros seems to be a slightly different thing, but within the main area of Westeros, no. And so connected with this, there's no particular hint that this was the Maesters, the Citadel, that stamped it out in some way. It was already looked down on. But the Maesters, having gone out to all the ruling houses and they're teaching their children as they grow up, I'm sure helped to ingrain that throughout society. As you were asking about the sort of the the origins of the Citadel. We have again. I'll read this. I always find it quite interesting. Well, I hope you do too. To read out what George R. R. Martin has actually told us about these kind of things, and then we can just say, well, how do we react to that? So the origins of the Citadel. We read are almost as mysterious as those of the High Tower itself. Most credit its founding to the second son of Uthal of the High Tower, Prince Peramore the Twisted, a sickly boy born with a withered arm and twisted back. Peramore was bedridden for much of his short life, but had an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond his window. So he turned to wise men, teachers, priests, healers, and singers, along with a certain number of wizards, alchemists, and sorcerers. It is said that the prince had no greater pleasure in life than listening to these scholars argue with one another. When Peramore died, his brother King Oregon bequeathed a large tract of land beside the honey wine to Peramore's pets, that they might establish themselves, continue teaching, learning, and questing after truth. And so they did. So my reading of that, and I've got no reason to doubt that, as yes, this is the Maesters telling us of their own origin story, so we have to take it with a little pinch of salt. But I think that there's no particular reason to think that that isn't, or some version of that isn't what actually happened. One of the High Towers took an interest in learning about the world. Maybe it was this Peramore the Twisted, brought in a whole load of people, and then after he died, what are you going to do with this whole load of incredibly learned people? Well, let's give them a bit of land, and they can basically set up what we might now call a university. So that seems like the origin story. The interesting thing there, I think, is that origin story includes, and I quote, wizards, alchemists, and sorcerers. So the Maester's commitment not to have magic, it didn't start right away. It evolved over time. As for the link across to, are these people bought out of slavery? I mean, it's possible. Wise men, teachers, priests, healers, and singers. Maybe some of them are slaves that were brought over, but we have no record of these being slaves. They're called scholars. So maybe, I think is the answer, but I can't see any evidence in there that is the case. Lord Bodici saying, hello, Robert. I hope you had a lovely last week now that southern England is getting a bit more sunny. It is actually, it's been a lovely week. I have a very meta question for you. There seems to be significant overlap between fans of fantasy and science fiction, but why? We're kind of moving beyond the Doom here, by the way. We've got a few broader questions coming up. We'll return to the Doom in a moment. There seems to be a significant overlap between fans of fantasy and science fiction, but why? I've always adored fantasy, but I've never felt any interest in sci-fi. In fact, I haven't even watched Star Wars or Star Trek or any of that. Please hold your horror in the chat. In fact, although I'll probably sound like a heretic, I'd actually claim that fantasy and sci-fi are opposites. As in sci-fi, advanced science takes on the role that magic has in fantasy, and this undoes the inexplicable elements that make the genre a true source of escapism. Right. So, why are they so? Why is there so much crossover? I mean, my general take is that what we think of as kind of like modern fantasy and sci-fi, actually, when that started to emerge, there wasn't this distinct branching out and just way of saying this is fantasy and that's science fiction. They often had terms like science fantasy, which were used for people like Wells, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Mary Shelley. A lot of these kinds of things, when you read them, Frankenstein is often called the first science fiction story, but that was like science fantasy. It's not actually, if you do these things you will definitely get there's an element of, it's not magic, but there's an element of kind of mystery to this. Similarly, you get Jules Verne, H.G. Wells. Yes, it's based upon this idea that a scientist has done these things, but it's more kind of like hand wavy as to what the science is. I just invented time travel machine. It's the story, the adventure of the story is not so much in the here's the details of exactly how that happened as the what is the implications of somebody now being able to move through time. So that I think is where it sort of kind of starts, the kind of the merging of the two. I think a lot of people colloquially still talk about science fiction covering fantasy. Bookshops obviously have embedded this. A lot of bookshops you'll go, they'll have a science fiction and fantasy section, and everything's mixed in together. So people are much more likely, if they're reading one book from this shelf here, to be picking up another book from the same shelf. Um, I would also argue that the kind of the mix of science fiction and fantasy. Interesting, you say you haven't watched Star Wars or Star Trek. Much, in my view, of popular science fiction um, is actually still quite science fantasy. So, for example, a classic example is Dune. Star Wars, before they started trying to explain things with midichlorians, was still very much use the Force. It felt like Space Wizards, the earlier Star Wars films. Dune is very much feels about it feels very much like a kind of like George R. R. Martin in space at times when you're reading it. We're talking about great houses with these kind of political machinations between them. We're talking about prophecies. We're talking about magic users. It's there's a lot there that feels a lot more fantasy than science fiction. It has to be said. Um, so, I mean, where does all that leave us? I mean, personally, I like the phrase that which has sort of gone out of fashion for various reasons, but I like speculative fiction because I think for me the thing that I like is the a story that isn't necessarily just about the world that we're in. We understand all the rules, we know everything that's going on, but allows us to expand out behind that. And then, I missed out saying it a bit earlier, but you talked about social science fiction. Being able to look from that new angle at our own world, I think is an astonishing thing that you cannot do when you've just got the world as we understand it, the interactions that we have. If you create something new and then look back at or look at that, you can see our own world from different angles. And for me, that is true both from a science fiction perspective, where you're looking at things that either are scientifically possible or are theoretically could be scientifically possible, and a more fantastical kind of approach where you don't have to have any kind of justification for why magic things happen. They're just there, whether that's overlaid on our own world or creating completely new worlds. Yeah, that for me is why they do remain close together, because they have the same kind of feel. And there's, as well as the looking back at our own world, there's also the escapism perspective. I highly recommend you take a look and see what Tolkien and Lewis and people talk about fantasy as escapism, fairy stories as escapism, in the most positive sense possible. Is that sometimes we do want to escape, and to some people that feels like it's like just trying to ignore reality. But if you're a prisoner, actually it's your duty to escape. Do follow that up. I mean, it's a fascinating question. Do have a chat about it in the chat. But yeah, I think those are the reasons why it's often conflated in people's minds. Michelle Ramo asking, in addition to fire and blood magic, what other magic do you think was practiced in Valyria? Um, well, fire and blood, we get Maester, Archmaester Marwyn, who says all of Valyrian magic was based in fire and blood. So I think it's fair to say that the core Valyrian magic probably was. But within the Valyrian freehold, there were definitely other types of magic. So, for example, the Voynich, the Rhoynar, they had water magic. And when you read the accounts of like the Valyrians and the Roynish fighting, it does seem like they're summoning giant turtles and setting jets of water up to try and attack the dragons. It's all great stuff. Not Valyrian type magic. And the Valyrians had slaves, and the slaves that they had were from across the freehold, from all over Essos, and those slaves will themselves have practiced their own kinds of magic. And we know this because some of those the slaves managed to rebel and took over their ships and took them all the way up the coast to land in and found a new place, a new city called Bravos. And the religions that were there were amongst those people founded the religions that we have in Bravos, which has 1,001 religions. So, um, what else it wouldn't surprise me. I think that there's an unexplored link with a shy, so I think shadow binding is probably also there. But the magic that we know, Fire and Blood, is that it involves sacrifice, it involves fire, and that is the Valyrian magic, though there probably were other types of magic. Lady Vaughan-Strauss saying, when it comes to the discovery and initial curation of dragon's eggs, there are two main lines of thinking in folklore history on how that sort of thing would come about. First, you have the small folk, the peasants, or in this fictional case, the goat herders, who are often seen as holding esoteric knowledge of the land around them. With this knowledge, they can do things that seem magical to outsiders, but is really just the effect of encountering wholly different knowledge. These are the humans who could combine fireworms and wyverns through natural practices, which would appear more magical than it is. The second would entail the idea of actual magic, often from supernatural creatures such as fairies, trolls, gnomes, or in this world, the children of the forest. As obligate forest dwellers, they appear to solely manipulate nature, and obviously dragon eggs would fall easily into that category. But as to the why of them doing it, I cannot guess. Perhaps when fire did not fully work, they tried ice. So, what do you feel is the more likely scenario in this story? Again, only referring to the very beginning of the dragon's eggs, peasant knowledge or true magic? Well, George R. Martin, I don't think is going to be telling us this. If I had to sort of speculate myself, I think draconic creatures have clearly been around in this world. They seem to exist way back when we're reading about the ancient civilizations. That there are magical creatures, draconic creatures. There are wyverns out in the wild in other parts of the world as well. So the Valyrians did seem to be doing this kind of gene splicing, which is both linking themselves, the dragon riders, to the dragons, and also seem to have been trying to create extra creatures through magical technology, as it were. How did they get there? Well, I think knowledge from ancient times is definitely a part of this. I mean, you sort of say, is it like is it the goat herders or is it the children of the forest? I mean, I think that there are other answers here. Personally, I think that the Ashai seems to have been holders of ancient knowledge even before the Valyrian freehold was around. It would not surprise me if this was more kind of joined together than that. So the goat herders, the sheep herders, whatever, maybe they discovered some draconic beasts that they could personally bond with in some way, and then they linked this with ancient information that they could get from a shy, and they strengthened that bond so it became what we think of as being the kind of the Targaryen dragon bond. And then it sort of like snowballed from that. I have this. So I don't want to overplay this, but I have this thought in the back of my mind that's been nagging at me for a while about George R. R. Martin and House of the Dragon. We know he has thoughts about season 2 and potentially season 3 of House of the Dragon. I don't want to get too far into that debate. I think it's definitely worth remembering that he said very, very positive things about episodes, certainly episodes 1, 2, and 4. He seems to have liked episode 3 as well, but he hasn't specifically said about that, so he certainly liked that. The things that he seemed to specifically not like were things to do with what he called toxic butterflies, things that were changed that would have knock-on effects in the future or past in the story. So one of those I mentioned earlier, the dragon roaming thing. This was what he went off on a mini rant is probably the wrong word, but he on his blog post he said in House of the Dragon, basically he said this, I'm paraphrasing, in House of the Dragon, we now have Sheep Stealer who should have been on Dragonstone, but she's appearing, the Sheep Stealer, the dragon is now appearing in the Vale of Arryn. That should not happen because the knock-on implications. In my world, he says, dragons stay where they are. Dragons do not roam. Why is this important? Because if dragons roam, and one of the examples he used, if dragons roam, then that meant that the Doom of Valyria, the dragons wouldn't all be concentrated in one place. They'd have been spread out all over the place if dragons roam, but they don't. They stay where they are, which means when the Doom of Valyria happened, big explosion, the dragons did all die. That, therefore, is important. And so if you have a dragon roaming in your story, that is undoing the internal logic of the universe. So, butterflies. And he started talking about toxic butterflies, that things that you're changing now will have big implications later on in the story. The blood and cheese thing also was, he used this as an example. My thought on this was that perhaps one of the other issues he has, where a lot of people are concerned that it seems as if Rhaena Targaryen is taking over the role of Nettles. And why is this important? Well, I think most people say, well, there's kind of a knock-on effect here, because obviously then if she's taking on that role, then she won't later be able to take on having mourning as a dragon, which is going to be very important going on into Blood and Fire in the books. This hugely changes the dynamic with Daemon, and frankly, Nettles is a really good and interesting character, and why on earth would you get rid of her? So that, I think, is where, but it does make me wonder, is that he showed a completely different way of forming a dragon bond through Nettles. And that was the sheep stealer model. She every day gave this dragon a sheep until the dragon learned to trust her, and then she could bond with the dragon and ride it. And that, I wonder, could link across to this goat herders, sheep herders idea from way back in the mist of time, is how might the initial Valyrians have made that bond? He has told us that the bond does not have to happen from somebody with Targaryen or Valyrian blood. If you're talking about Rhaena Targaryen, she would have bonded with the dragon anyway. That was going to happen anyway. The whole point about Nettles in the story is nobody expected her to. And she showed you can bond with a dragon by just feeding it sheep. And so that, for me, it's not a fully developed idea. I don't want to get too much into what George R. R. Martin might have been thinking, might not have been thinking, but it does, it sort of harks back to this idea of how did the Valyrians originally manage to get close enough to a dragon to build that trust that they could eventually bond with them. And if you don't show that somewhere, then that again takes that out of your universe. So it's a random thought, but let's go on to a question from Gina Z. Do you think Euron went to Valyria in person? What is the evidence for and against it? So Euron claims to have gone to Valyria, and he comes back and he has Dragonbinder, this massive horn, which is clearly Valyrian. It's got Valyrian glyphs on the side. It's clearly magical. And we'll almost certainly see it have some magical power when he uses it in Slave. Well, he doesn't use it. He's got people to use it in Slaver's Bay. He also, it's not emphasized at all in the text, but it's very noticeable when he's there at the Kingsmoot and he's trying to win over the various captains. He doesn't, it's not just the blowing of this massive horn that wins out, it's the fact that he brings these huge chests filled with treasure and just dumps it down. And we get this list of what's there, including several Valyrian steel daggers, which is like, whoa, that's a lot. They're very expensive, incredibly rare. Where did that come from? So the evidence that he did do this is that he has got some things that could have come from there. The counter to that is that if mountains didn't survive the Doom of Valyria, do we really think that a horn would, or some daggers? Could he not have just picked these up from somewhere else? He has raided all the way around the coast of Essos. We know he attacks ships. This is where he attacked the ship with the Undying on, with the warlocks on. That's where he got his big barrel of Shade of the Evening drink from. And he's not a person who seems particularly beholden to the truth. So the evidence is, I would say, slight. I think the fact that he has cut out the tongues of the people who work on his boat does seem to suggest that there are things that he does not wish them to be repeating. You could argue that is evidence one way or the other. Personally, I liked when we were last talking about this on the live stream, somebody suggested that perhaps he didn't go there, but he went close and then sent his minions in, and then they brought stuff back, and then he might have killed them or cut their tongues out or something along those lines. That kind of sounds like a Euron kind of thing to do. He's not stupid. He will know that that's a very dangerous place to go, and everybody who's gone there has not survived. So, whereas maybe he's crazy enough to go there, the important thing for him is the legend is that he did that, not that he actually did that. Stephen saying, "Hi, Robert. In case it needs to be asked, what is your present preferred theory of who or what caused the doom?" I think I answered that one earlier, if that is okay. Then you say, I remember a while ago that George R. R. Martin mentioned in an interview or a blog that the doom was actually an accident, but to me this does not rule out the faceless men, since a lot of their victims meet with very unfortunate accidents. Well, I haven't seen this. If anyone wants to put down in the comments underneath a link to that, I would be absolutely fascinated. If he does say that this was an accident, then that could well change everything. I've not seen that. But yes, certainly one of the things that the Faceless Men do is to make deaths look like an accident. And this is a classic example. It has to be said that if they did do it, they're not there holding up their hands. In fact, it's a thing that is the kindly man says to Arya, this is not a tale for sharing, really. So they're not out there claiming credit for it, but it does bear all the hallmarks of the kind of thing that they would do. Stephen, was the doom of Valyria a self-fulfilling prophecy? As we know, the Targaryens survived because Daenerys the Dreamer foresaw the doom, so they took their dragons and escaped to Dragonstone, a remote island on the western frontier. Now, if it is true that the Maesters were ultimately responsible for the doom, that begs the question, why go to such extremes? Being philosophically opposed to magic is one thing, but how could they justify committing the greatest and most destructive atrocity in history? Perhaps they felt they had to act. Perhaps they feared that Valyria, with all its fire and magic and unstoppable power, would soon pose a direct threat to Westeros itself. And what would make them think that? Perhaps receiving news that the Valyrians, armed with dragons, had just established an outpost on Westeros's doorstep. So, yeah, I mean, I think this builds on stuff I've been saying already in the stream, but Um, the Valyrians had not been advancing into Westeros, but they'd been creeping ever slowly closer. Um, Claw Island, Driftmark, the lower ranked families had been put into there. Then we get Dragonstone, and that was built as this amazing fortress. Uh, we don't know who was there beforehand, but the Targaryens then moved in after. And it's, yeah, when you start getting dragons flying around Blackwater Bay, which would have happened, then this suddenly does seem quite a threat. So the argument here, which I think is what your argument is that um, Daenerys the Dreamer had a a dream about the Doom. The family moved over to Dragonstone. The Maesters went, the dragons are coming. We better do something about this. And then they spent the money to hire the Faceless Men. I could buy into that. As I say, we don't have the specific evidence, but it is very clear that dragons were there, and this will have felt as if the dragons at some point, the Valyrians at some point, would be invading. And the Maesters' happy world, where they're sort of like trying to create this world of science and reason, would have no chance. If they were going to do something, they would have to destroy the Valyrian freehold as a whole. The only way to do that was something that dramatic. So if they finally had the money from the Lannisters that they could do it, it does all, it ties together. As I say, it's not 100% yet, but it does all tie together. Catherine, it has always struck me that the noble houses of Valyria had something of a god complex, closer to gods than men and all that. And why not? Having blood magic, dragons, and empire slaves, how could they not? Um, when you picture life among the nobles, how do you see them viewing themselves and their role in the world? I must admit, I kind of view them as self-important, entitled, cruel because of the slaves' conditions, scheming. Well, it doesn't paint a particularly nice picture of the character, and we see vestiges of this self-importance in the Targaryens in Westeros. So, how do you view the nobles of Valyria, and what this tells us about the ultimate character of Targaryens in the current story? So I agree absolutely that they do not come across well. They kept slaves in appalling conditions. The kind of the knock-on effects with the Targaryens, that they do consider themselves closer to gods than men. They think that they're different. They think that the rules do not apply to them. Um, uh, Undeniably, there is an arrogance to the Targaryens. I do, in their defense, though, have to say that at some point, between them arriving at Dragonstone and moving over to Westeros, they stopped doing slavery. We're not told all the details of this, but we're told they took their slaves with them, and when they get to Westeros, they don't have slaves. So perhaps this is Aegon himself, who went to great pains to try and, I mean, he went this far and no further. I'm still married to my sister wives. I'm still, I worship other gods, etc. I'm different, but he went out of his way to kind of meet the local customs halfway. He got a house sigil, which wasn't a Valyrian thing at all. He made sure that he was crowned by the High Septon, not his religion, but the religion of the land. He recognized the powers that be. He took away the kingships, so we no longer have the King of Winter in the north, but he said the Starks can stay there. As much as he could, he did compromise with what was there. And it feels likely to me that it was him who said, and you don't do slaves here, we're not going to do slaves. Uh, but however it happened, I think we need to give them credit that they did move away from that. And the Targaryens have also not, they've not really been expansionary. The Valyrian freeholds kept on slowly spreading out and out, needed more power, more control over more people. The Targaryens seem to have taken Westeros, and other than their long-standing ambition to get Dawn as a part of it, which may well be from this original vision that Aegon had. Apart from that, they weren't really expansionary. They weren't like, oh, we should, why don't we take a little bit of the west coast of Essos? Why don't we see whether we can subdue Pentos? We've got some dragons, we could do that. They never really go down that road. They seem actually settled ruling the Seven Kingdoms, even when they have this overwhelming power with all the dragons. So the Targaryens seem not just to be like the Valyrians, and we haven't met any other Valyrians from the old times, so we have to just kind of judge them by what evidence we have before us. But the Targaryens seem a bit better, a bit nicer than them, I would say. Adam Geets with just a few quick questions to round off, saying, after listening to the Summerhall live stream, which was that last week? I've forgotten. Anyway, could King Aegon have expected to sacrifice most of his family to bring dragons back? Could that be tied to the heroic sacrifice that Duncan made? Yeah, so I was talking about this last time, and I think the conclusion I came was he will definitely have been made aware that in order to do this, you need fire and blood. So you need some sort of sacrifice. Somebody will have told that to him. Now, we do not know enough about Egg as he grows up, other than the fact that he became fixated on this idea, very focused on the idea of hatching the dragon eggs. We do not know how far he would have gone in this. Might he have considered sacrifices? I find it very unlikely that the people who did actually die, his son, for example, himself, and his best friend, they were the people he intended to die. So I think George R. Martin at the moment is leaving it up to us to decide, could Egg go that far? He'd have to come a very long way from the kind of person we see in the Duncan Egg stories. But he has got quite a few years to grow old, and he's got to rule the Seven Kingdoms. So I think he's leaving that one open. And it is an intriguing question. I mean, I personally hope he doesn't go down that route. And perhaps that's part of the reason why it didn't actually work. You also said if Aegon started the conquest of Westeros because of a prophecy of the others, my question is, why would he care? He's not on the mainland of Westeros anyway. He's safe from Dragonstone. Well, for me, this depends on the wording of it. He had a dream, a vision, and if this was something which took over the whole world, then yeah, of course he cares. It's not. Firstly, for him to just be caring about himself and his family implies that we think that he's a very self-centered person, which he may have been, but I don't think the evidence is there that he just thinks about himself. If you learn an entire continent's worth of people are going to be destroyed unless you do a thing, and you say, well, that's not my business, that doesn't paint a very good picture of you. So, I mean, I would argue he could still do it because that's the right thing to do. But secondly, if the vision he had was it might come down through Westeros, but it's going everywhere, as per the first long night, incidentally, that seemed to affect Essos as well as Westeros, then it makes actual rational sense. And then you also said, I don't understand why a sword forged from a meteor would help against the others. Is there a chance that the meteor hit a weirwood tree and fused some of it into the metal? Have we any information about any weirwoods in Starfall? Well, we don't have any information about weirwoods in Starfall. And this is one of those things I fear that George R. R. Martin will leave. He likes magic to be mysterious, not to have the full answers. But it is a fantasy trope that magic does come from above, from the stars, from red comets and things like that. That is the herald of the red comet is the herald of Azor Ahai reborn. the prince that was promised, and is there clearly playing an important role in some mystical way when Dany's dragon eggs hatch. So this idea that there are magical rocks that come from the sky, it's not new to George R. R. Martin, and it's not unique to this in this world. So yeah, it kind of I don't personally have an issue with it. We need to find another reason. If George R. R. Martin says this was a magical rock from the sky, personally, I think that works for me. Okay, so with that, I've come to the end of questions from my patrons. What we'll do, so this is going to be uploaded, if you've got this far. Thank you. This is going to be uploaded as a premiere, which means that you should be watching it with the chat there. I hope you've got had some good chat time there as well. I may well have spent a bit of time there, in which case, thank you, moderators. You are amazing. You always are. I can say this confidently, even though I'm talking to future you, if that makes sense. But I will be back next week with another live stream. It might be another pre-recorded one. We will see how we go. But we'll be continuing our series looking at mysteries in the world of Ice and Fire. If you have got to the end of this video, then hopefully somewhere around here, if you're watching back a bit later, will be a link to more live streams that I've done. Appearing somewhere around here will be a link to my Patreon page, which is the best way to support this channel if you wish to do so. So thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and I will see you again same time next week. Bye.